We're in the book of Esther still. If you're wondering where that is, if you have a digital thing, then I don't have to tell you because you get a freebie. But if you're still using paper, if you can find any of the poetry stuff like Psalms or Proverbs or Job, just go left and you get to Esther. First off, it's been a good morning. I want to recognize that this is the Wells' is this your last Sunday with us? So we have loved having the Wells family with us. Thank you for your participation with our community while you've been here. We've loved having you. So make sure that you say hey to them before they leave today. We're going to be in Esther chapter 5. And we're going to have a long passage today. But I'm going to start with the punchline. I don't normally start with the punchline. Usually I read a lot and talk a lot, and then I'm going to eventually get to the punchline. I'm going to start with the punchline. The punchline is sovereign soup. Sovereign soup. We live in sovereign soup. A big world size. What do I mean by sovereign soup? What is this? And this is going to be an analogy that's going to run all the way through today's message. And like all analogies, it breaks down if you look at it too carefully. So understand that. No human analogy is perfect. It'll break down if you push too hard. Sovereign soup. Sovereign soup. Every single day, all around the world, people are adding ingredients to the world. They're adding their actions, what they do, their opinions, their Facebook posts, their phone calls. The media is putting stuff on the TV and on the internet, and people do things. All of us are. We're adding it constantly into the pot. There's things that we like. There's things that we don't like. There's things that we understand. There's things that we can't begin to comprehend that people do. People do too much. People do too little. They go too early. They're too late. Or maybe people just don't do nothing and we just wish they would do something. But people are doing things, and we have opinions about the things that people do. And then something happens that is really hard to understand. Sometimes it's even hard to accept. That the soup comes out exactly the way God planned. That even though all kinds of people added whatever they added, God's still in control of the outcome of the soup. And that's hard, which is why I'm calling it sovereign soup. Sovereign is the control. It's the control that God has over the world. Esther's got some sovereign soup going on, and we're going to talk about some of the sovereign soup happening in Esther. We've been in the book of Esther for a few weeks now, and the ingredients have been flying into the soup. We have 4 main characters in the story. The first main character is King Asuras, emperor of the Persian Empire, leader of about 44% of the world population of his time, including the lands of Judah. So even though this is after the captivity and many Jews have been allowed to go home, the place where the Jews live is still controlled by the Empire of Persia. So any rule or ruling or decree that this king gives impacts the entire country of Judah. He's been doing some stuff. He's been adding stuff to the soup, like divorcing his wife. Esther, an orphan Jewish girl, who against all mathematical odds becomes the new queen after King Asuras gets his drunken dispute with his wife. And they get divorced. Then Mordecai, Esther's own cousin, who took responsibility for her when her parents died. And Haman, the king's new right-hand man, born of a nation that hates Jews. And each of these characters has been adding ingredients to what's going on. The king is self-absorbed and flippant with edicts early on against women. Esther is beautiful and respectful and graceful and all the qualities needed to become the queen. Mordecai is loyal and forming the king of a plot against him. Haman is angry that the Jew Mordecai and all the Jews won't bow to him and his authority, and in his anger he has devised a plan to destroy all Jews everywhere in the known world. And the king, still self-absorbed and flippant, isn't paying much attention and approves Haman's law. Mordecai reacts with public protest, getting as close to the king as he can in sackcloth and ashes and demonstrating his distress, along with Jews everywhere in all different kinds of cities who are doing the same. And Esther nervously agrees to approach the king despite the clear risk of death if the king decides he doesn't want to see her. And I have to say that at this point the soup is looking pretty gross. It's looking pretty poisonous. The poisons of hate and unforgiveness, of pride, have been poured liberally into this soup by Haman. Even an amateur cook like me would take one whiff of this soup and say, that mess is going to kill a lot of people. I'm going to step in here, just in case you don't know the end of the story. It comes out good for the Jews. By the time we are finished, it will be clear that God's vision for the soup is absolutely realized. But right now, as we're looking at the picture, it doesn't look too good. Today we're going to look at 4 types of ingredients that are going to get added to the sovereign soup. And we're going to look about how we do react and maybe how we can adjust our reactions, because in the same way that in this story there's different things that come into play in our lives, in the world now, in our communities, there are things that come into play and we don't always react well. We need to understand that God's still in control. Today's passage is a little bit longer, so hang with me. It's Esther 5:1 through Esther 6:14. So I've got a bit of territory to read. So here we go. Esther 5, starting with verse 1. Now it came about on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And it happened, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it will be given to you." And Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him." And then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. And as they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be done." So Esther answered and said, "My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will ask the king to do what it will do." In verse 9, then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above all the princes and the servants of the king. And Haman also said, "Even Esther the queen, let no one but me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared, and tomorrow I'm also invited by her with the king." Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends said to him, "Have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it, and then go joyfully with the king to the banquet." And the advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. During that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Zeresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Asuras. And the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in with the king and said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" Now Haman said to himself, "Who would the king desire to honor more than me?" Then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe, which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe of the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most notable princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on a horseback to the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" And that's actually where I plan to stop 9, not 14. We are stopping there. Okay, that's a lot of material, but I promise I'm going to summarize. I'm not going to talk about every single word. I promise. There are 4 types of ingredients that we're going to see, and there's going to be an order to them, but the first kind of ingredients that we see added to the soup are ingredients we approve of, ingredients we like. In chapter 5, 1 through 5, we have Esther, the orphan, who became queen, acting with courage and dignity, facing death for her people, and she's rewarded with honor. And this all feels really great. This looks good. It feels good. It's nice. Somebody told me the other day after the sermon about the vision they had about that scepter being extended and how they feel like it's so cool because of Jesus Christ, when we approach God's throne, he extends the scepter and every single time we're accepted. It was a wonderful vision. And here's Esther in the throne room of the king. And she could have died. She could have come up into his presence unannounced, and if he had not extended that scepter, she would have been gone. But that's not what happened. It is right to celebrate these ingredients. We should strive to be the people who add these things to the world. Acts of courage, acts of trust, acts of faithfulness, acts of obedience. We look to such moments for inspiration, and that's good. But here's our temptation that we have to fight against, and this is really important. Our temptation is to credit the ultimate success of the soup on those ingredients that we like. Here's why that's a problem. It's not the ingredients that makes the soup perfect, it's the cook that makes the soup perfect. Everyone hear that? It's not the ingredients. I used Cheryl as a resource this week. There's an ingredient that costs $3,386 per kilo. It's Italian white truffles. You may not like mushrooms at all, so you may just think that that's a terrible ingredient, period. Nevertheless, they are easily overpowering. It would be easy to take this extremely fine, extremely expensive ingredient that is wonderful and ruin the dish. We don't have good food just because we took good ingredients and put them in a pile. Some good ingredients don't go well together, for instance. The ingredients alone don't make it turn out right. But we can put the pressure on us or on other people that somehow it belongs to me. Or not only does it belong to me if it's wrong, like if I didn't do it, then it's all my fault, but if I did do it, it's all my glory. It's not our glory when it all comes out right. Even if we did the right thing in the midst of it, it's not our glory. The glory doesn't belong to Esther. She did a good thing. It's a nice ingredient. It's a joyful. We rejoice it. We want it. We want more of it. But it isn't her glory. We're just happy she did it. We're pleased with both the actions of the king and Esther. But the ultimate glory still goes to the cook, not to the ingredients. The second kind of ingredient I want to talk about are the ingredients we don't understand. Ingredients we don't understand. What am I getting at that? Well, let's look at verses 6 through 8. The king has promised several times now to Esther, whatever you ask, I will do it even to half the kingdom. He said it out loud several times. Yet Esther gets to the king, has her moment, and what does she say? Come back tomorrow. She doesn't ask. I don't know why she doesn't ask. It may make sense to somebody in this room, and if it does, I'm happy for that, and that's not actually sarcasm. There may be somebody in this room that reads that and go, yep, that makes complete sense to me. That's okay, actually. It's okay. I don't get it. I can't. Nothing that I know about dealing with authority or interacting with busy, important people or strategies for getting people to do what we want them to do relates to what Esther just did. And I used to teach peons how to get important people to do what they wanted them to do. I used to teach this stuff. This isn't what you do. You don't get all the way to the boss, successfully negotiate getting there, have the boss tell you, I'll do everything you want, and then postpone it to the next day. That's just, nobody would advise you to do this. Having said that, I personally had to receive a mini sermon from God this week. This happens to me frequently. The truth is, I was quite critical of Esther when I read this, as you may have already noticed. And I was quite comfortable in my criticism of Esther until God smacked me. And here's what God smacked me with. How dare I, thousands of years after this woman lived, not belonging to her culture, not knowing her relationship with the king, not knowing what it was like to be married to him. I've never been to the place where this happened. How dare I think I know better what to do than Esther did? And I had to accept that I had some arrogance. Because really, any thought that I today, in my circumstances and my world, so far removed from her, think that I could tell her better what to do is just plain dumb. So here's the free mini sermon now for you, because this is just from my experience. It's not really directly from the passage. But maybe there's someone else in this room that needs to hear this other than me. Just remember, we don't understand other people's situations half as well as we think, and we need to dial back the criticism a lot. It is easy to stand wherever we are with whatever experiences we have or whatever background we have and look down and think, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. And we can do that way too easy. I did it this week with somebody who died thousands of years ago. Mini sermon over. So I'm left with actions and ingredients that I don't understand. And even if you do feel like you understand why Esther is doing that, that's fine. The point is still valid. All of us are confronted from time to time by actions, Sometimes actions by people we like or good people, and the actions that they take confuse us. We don't understand why they did it. What do we do with that? Because the fact of the matter is we often do very bad things with that. We try to guess their motives, or we assume their motives, or we get anxious on their behalf, or we say things like, if only they had asked me, I would have made sure they did the right thing. We doubt. We become pessimistic. Oh, I'm not sure this is going to turn out well. It's so easy to insert our experience or our perspective or our bias into how we feel about what other people do, particularly when we don't understand why they did it. It's like an invitation to speculate. And then if we take that invitation and we start speculating, we often go places mentally and spiritually we should never have gone. Let's just take a moment for some blunt honesty. It doesn't matter. You're not the chef. You're not the cook. You're not the one who has to take what they did that you don't understand and have it made in the soup. That's not your job. That's God's job. It's God's job to take these things that people do that we don't always get, that we don't understand, that maybe we're not sure why. It isn't our job to make it work. It's God's job to make it work. If we could step out of it and realize that we're not making the soup, that God's making the soup, we could dial down the criticism and the speculation and the angst that we have when people are doing things we don't understand. God will do what is needed. And in this case, we're going to see that exact thing. See, Esther did this thing that I never would advise anyone, and it turns out for the best. I would never have, as a person who's advised people on working with leadership, told Esther to do this, but it's wonderful that Esther did this. It works out beautifully. See, it doesn't matter whether I understand what Esther did. God still took all the pieces and went, I want this, and that's what I'm going to have. And so I have absolute proof sitting right in front of me. Esther did something that I would not have advised, but it doesn't matter. God took it all and made it beautiful. The ingredients that we don't understand can be just as vital to the success of the soup as the ingredients that we cheer about. Which means we sometimes need to check our reactions when people do things that we find confusing. Number 3, our third category is from chapter 5, verses 9 through 14. And this is Haman's poison. It's the ingredients we hate. It's the ingredients we know are evil. The truth is, by this point, Haman has already dumped a whole barrel of toxic waste into the soup. And there's this whole thing about the law, and this law about killing Jews everywhere and coming up with a date and trying to bribe the king and all this. Haman has already dumped poison in the soup. And he's just adding another vial. In his arrogance and his overconfidence, he adds more. As always, Mordecai doesn't bow. Of course, now remember that Mordecai is now in sackcloth and ashes. Actually, if you read the text carefully, it says this time he's mad that he didn't stand up. Usually he's mad that Haman doesn't bow. This time he's mad that Haman didn't get up, or that Mordecai didn't get up from his sackcloth and ashes in his mourning to recognize him. Mordecai can't do anything right. He cannot please Haman. He can't please Haman because Haman hates Mordecai. This is what happens when we hate people. When we hate people, whatever they do will be wrong. Whatever they do will piss us off. Whatever they do will make us go home and complain to our wife. It won't matter when we hate. Haman doesn't feel any satisfaction, it seems, even from Mordecai's lament. I don't know, it seems like if you want to destroy a people, Watching them mourn and lament maybe would have been satisfying, like you would have felt like you were winning. I mean, it's conceivable that Haman would have gone, oh, there's the evidence of my hard work to make these people grovel. Even that isn't helping. Talk about fixated. In verse 11, he brags about his favor and his greatness. In verse 12, he brags about how even the queen seems to favor him. He doesn't know she's Jewish. That would totally twist his nut. Verse 13, no amount of success or recognition or power can make up for his hate. And his hate makes him bitter, and his hate consumes him. Haman can only add hate to the soup because hate is the only thing he has. You add whatever you've got. That's what we add to life. That's what we add to the equation. That's what we add to the conversation. We add what we have. Hate is all the ingredients that Haman's got. Just a word of warning, we really need to avoid being Haman. How do we do that? Well, by keeping a check on our anger and forgiving people before it becomes hatred. Look, he was having a great day. But as soon as he saw Mordecai at the gate, it ruined it. In verse 13, that's what we see. Yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. All these great things and all my sons and my riches and the glory and my good job and the king likes me, and yet all I've got to do is see that guy and my day's ruined. When a person becomes so disgusting to us that it overshadows every pleasant thing, that it doesn't matter how good of a day we were having, if we see them in the supermarket, or we see them in the square, or we see them on the street, if it ruins our day, we have a problem. Because we've allowed someone to become so powerful in our lives that they would overshadow every good thing. That's a forgiveness problem on our part. That's what Haman is living. It doesn't matter how good of a day he's having if he sees that guy. It's over. The truth is, there's a lot of hate in the soup. Now, I don't just mean the soup of Esther. I mean the soup we live in. I'm talking about the soup of the world right now. There's a lot of hate and fear and greed and lies and filth. There's a lot of poison in the soup. Every single one of us, let's be honest, has dumped poison in the soup. And that's not a nice thought. It's sobering. And here's the thing, that poison, it's the power to kill. And sneak peek to the future of Esther, people are going to die. That power to kill isn't leaving the soup. It's in there. And it's going to have its effect. But it's not going to end up in the bowl of the person that Haman expected it to be in. The poison's still in the soup. God's going to decide whose bowl the poison goes in. We'll come back to that idea later. Our fourth category is the best part. It's the subtle tweaks of the master chef. Starting in chapter 6, verse 1. During the night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. Look, the ingredients are already there. All of the pieces are already there. All of the poison and all the good stuff and all the confusing stuff and all the other stuff and it's all in there. And everybody is who they are. And God isn't going to change who the king is. But instead of letting the king simmer, he's going to stir. And having stirred the king can't sleep. He hasn't changed who the king is. He just kept him from sleeping. The chef decides to stir. The chef decides to marry the flavor of Mordecai's previous loyal behavior to the arrogance of Haman. God doesn't have to make the king act like someone else. He doesn't have to make Haman taste any different, be any different than the exact person he is. God doesn't have to make anyone do anything in order to create the soup that he wants. He stirs what he wishes to stir, and he marries the flavors that are already there to his design. What a useful understanding of the sovereignty of God's ultimate control. And I'm not saying it's perfect. But no chef changes what the ingredients are. They simply know how to use what ingredients they have. This is the picture of God's control. Look, the analogy definitely breaks down as we realize that God can change people, and God does change people. And that is a breakdown. But we don't generally perceive God's input as force. In other words, God didn't force Haman to be Haman. God didn't force the king to be the king. God didn't force Esther to be Esther, and God didn't force Mordecai to be Mordecai. They all had choices. The world is full of people adding their ingredients, and God lets them. So how is God still in control if all these people get to add whatever they want? And the answer is because God still gets to turn up the heat or turn down the heat. He stirs what he wishes to stir, and he stills what he wishes to still. He removes people from the equation when he wants them gone, and he brings them together when he wants them connected. Every single event that we perceive as random is instead opportunity for God to control the moment. We simply have no clue the millions of ways that God puts his finger in the soup. Make no mistake, we may add ingredients to the pot, but the sovereign soup only has one cook, and he knows what he's doing. In the weeks to come, it's going to be easy to see how all these ingredients come together. It's much harder, though, in our own lives. And the truth is we can become very distracted and disappointed by the ingredients that are being added to our world and how we feel about those ingredients rather than remembering how good the cook is. Romans 8:28, I know it's a well-quoted verse. It's extremely appropriate to this topic. Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. That's a lovely promise to quote, and it's really easy to say, and it gives us a warm fuzzy, but then we look at Ukraine and really to put that together and say, God, how are you turning Ukraine to my good? See, that gets past my brain's ability to conceive. I have the promise, I believe the promise, I don't understand the promise. I don't understand how it works. I can't. But we see it illustrated. We see our New Testament saints acting in this kind of freedom. Like in Acts 16, verses 14 through 33, I'm going to summarize. Paul and Cyrus are in trouble. The ingredients have been a beating. Paul and Silas are imprisoned. And then they decide to add prayer and rejoicing to the soup. They're in jail, they've been beaten unjustly, and they've decided, my trust is in God. He's going to make it all okay even though I'm in jail. I'm going to pray and rejoice. That's what I'm going to add to the soup. Of course, the outcome is that God saves the souls of the jailer, his family, and sets Paul and Silas free. James 1:2, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. Key Stark commentary on James 1:2, God's just stirring the soup. So it's good to add good ingredients. Last week we looked at how grace and excellence leads to opportunity. And opportunity leads to risk. And courage allows us to face risks successfully. This is a good process that adds good ingredients, but that it doesn't make us the cook. And when our good ingredients don't seem to get the results we want, we can get cranky, we can get discouraged, and we can even quit trying. But the problem is that we are not the cook. We need to stop second guessing what God chooses to do with our contributions. It's his soup, not our soup. And when we encounter actions that confuse us, we need to resist the temptation to judge, to assume, to fix it. For all we know, God is thrilled by the exact thing that confuses us, because he knows exactly what to do with the thing that happened that confuses us. For some of us, learning to rest when other people do things we wouldn't have done may be one of the most important lessons we need to learn. And I certainly needed that reminder this week. And then there's the poison. I'm not happy that Russia is invading Hungary. Like I said earlier, I've lived very close to that part of the world. It's devastating and pointless and sad. This is barrel upon barrel of toxic waste poured into the world soup. I have some verses I want to read that we need to remember when we see ugliness happening. Romans 2:5. But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. Or how about John 3:36? Just 20 verses after that verse we really like, John 3:16. It's a little bit after that. He who believes in the Son has eternal life, but he who does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God shall be upon him. Or Revelation 8:13. And I looked, and I heard an eagle in the mid-heaven saying with a loud voice, woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth. There are people who clearly do evil things. And it is appropriate and right to call them evil. But it is not appropriate and right to despair. God will take all the poison and the toxin and the hate and the greed and the terror and the manipulation, and he will have the ultimate say as to where that and whose bowl it goes. There is poison in the soup, but the chef knows what to do with it. We must live in the confidence that God will handle the ingredients that we know don't belong there. We also, as Christians, have a hope that's very specific. We have something that's even more amazing that I don't even know if it could happen in my physical illustration. That because of Christ, God promises that he can reach into our lives and neutralize, destroy, and extract the poison that we have poured into our own actions, into our own families, into our own habits. That Jesus can cure it. He can make it go away. He can separate it from east to west. That the sin and the ugliness that we know is in our lives can be dealt with by a God who knows exactly how to do it. And we think about this when we talk about salvation, and that's great. And if there's someone here today that doesn't know Jesus, I want you to know that whatever poison you know that you've added in your life, that the solution is meeting Jesus, who can actually suck it out and forgive you and pull it out of the mix. But for those of us who have known Christ a long time, it can be easy to forget that that's still something that God's in the business of doing. That when we make mistakes, that when we mess it up, when we say the wrong stuff, when we lose our temper, when we do something that was ill-advised, that there is forgiveness and that God can fix it. He's still in the business of sucking the poison out. because he loves us and he promises that he will if we ask him to. So whether it's anger or hate or lust or greed or fear or whatever, let's not just expect God and his sovereignty to make it okay, because he will. Let's bring those poisons to God so he can put better things in the soup than that. So he can fix it in our lives. It isn't just enough that God and his sovereignty can make it all work anyway, and he will. We have more than that than we can claim. We can ask God to please get it out of our life. There's a lot of different bits in that sermon. But the big picture is this: God's going to win. And he's going to win exactly as he said he would win. And there's some stuff in here about God winning that in the process of God winning, ugly things happen. We can't be shocked when ugly things happen, when we know that ugly things happen in the process of God winning. It's not what we want. It isn't nice, but we can't be surprised. We need to, especially now, work on how we deal with each other. That we understand that it's his game and he's not going to lose. And we fumble around and we do what we do, and sometimes we mess it up, and sometimes we do pretty good, and that's all fine and dandy. It's still his soup, and it's going to be okay. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, in this passage of Esther, we see you taking all kinds of people with all different kinds of motives. God, I see you taking things that I like and things that I don't understand and things that I hate and mixing it all together for your glory, because you can. And we see a glimpse as to how you do it. The little things that you do to tweak what will happen, because that's the power you have. To in ways that we never see, in ways we never even expect or suspect. You are constantly working. And you are constantly changing. And you are deeply and personally and always ingrained in everything that's happening around us. Lord, our faith needs to be in your masterful skill. When we do good, help us to not feel pride, but to know that we've done good because you've asked us to do good, but the victory is yours. And when we see things that we don't understand, would you give us patience and kindness? Would you make us slow to judge? And when we see things that we know are evil, would we not despair? We need courage. We need courage to realize that you are not out of control. And you know exactly what to do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.